I'm a pastor. I can't be separated from my congregation. It's a privilege for me to be here. I don't recognize the person that you described. I thank you. You saw the caption on the screen that said the power of story. I think that the story that I'm going to tell you is going to reflect the power of story. There is nothing that can change attitudes, change people from being biased to somebody who's being inclusive like a story can. I am here only to tell a story. I am not here to say that what happened at Glendale City Church is a cookie-cutter formula for all congregations because, as we know, each congregation is a life and an entity unto itself. I am not here to argue the morality of what we did. I am here to share stories. This is the story of one congregation's difficult journey from an exclusive church toward an inclusive one. And let me tell you how exclusive that congregation was. When I was called there, I was the 35th pastor to be called as senior pastor of the Glendale City Church. When I was wrestling with whether to go or not, people came to my mother, who was a member of Glendale City Church, and they said, please talk to your son. He's a Mexican American, and we don't think he can fit here. This is an exclusive church for the elite. When I heard that, I knew the Lord was calling me there. And so I went. When I got there, the average attendance was 175. We're talking about a place that used to be packed. 6 years before I became senior pastor of that church, Arthur Beats would stand up to 1,100 people in the congregation, and one had to come to Sabbath school in order to secure a seat for the worship service. And I'm looking at 175 people, and I'm asking the question, what's happened here? Something definitely has happened, and what has happened isn't good. 2 years before I accepted being senior pastor, my wife and I and my little infant daughter, Allison, went to visit my mother at Glendale. And of course, we went to Glendale City Church, and we sat in the balcony. Now, if you've been there, you know that the balcony holds several hundred people. I counted 17. My little girl began, I wouldn't say she was crying, I would say she was cooing. And 14 sets of eyes leered at us, as if to say, get that screaming baby out of here. Don't you know that this is the church, of Jesus Christ, and here we come to worship God? And so, of course, we left. I understood why there were 175 people in the congregation when prior there had been 1,100. So now, I'm senior pastor, and one day during the second hymn, I look and I guesstimate the congregation, and I figure there are about 150. And I think to myself, I should have stayed at Green Lake. Silly me. I didn't see any possibility where that congregation could become a thriving, inclusive congregation that was following the Lord Jesus Christ, because everything. Little did I know that already within that congregation there was something wonderful that was taking place. You see, the Spirit takes over. The Spirit is not limited by our egotism, by our exclusiveness, by our attitudes. Already within this dying congregation, there were embers that were being fanned by a mysterious breeze. And one of those embers was a woman by the name of Mary Walsh. I don't know if you've ever heard of Mary Walsh, but Mary Walsh had been, well, she was as close to a Roman Catholic nun as you could ever find before she became a Seventh-day Adventist. She was in business in Ireland, and she came from London to New York City on a business trip, and an Adventist evangelist, a street evangelist, was preaching at the street corner, and he was preaching on the mark of the beast, the seal of God, the judgment, and all of this, and she became hooked. She resigned her position in London, and she went to college, prepared to be a Bible worker, and now she was the Bible worker at Glendale City Church and had been there for 6 or 7 years when I got there. Now, what you have to understand is that she had a very, very harsh, way. It was all doctrinal, but she had an absolute heart of gold. She was a dichotomy. On the one hand, she was strict and rigid. On the other hand, she was open and loved people. She didn't know that in the 20 baptisms that she was having every year, 50% of them were young gay men. So when I got there were 25 or 30 gay men in the congregation who were her converts. And of course, she had no clue. When they got in trouble, they didn't go to her. I'm talking about trouble, with their lifestyle, etc. They came to me, and I said, oh my, what hath the Lord wrought? I guess the Lord is calling us to do something about this. We did not set about to be an inclusive church, that would, put our arms around gays and lesbians. We decided that we were going to be an inclusive church, and in the process of becoming an inclusive church, it's just amazing at the kind of people that one catches. You understand what I'm saying? The first place, when I started preaching, my preaching has always attracted not right-wing Adventists, but other kinds of Adventists who are looking for answers. I'm not an evangelist, I'm a pastor. And a lot of people started coming in and they said, Mary Walsh, we got to get rid of her. She's no good for our church. If you're going to have an inclusive church, you cannot go after people whose doctrine you don't agree with. And I basically said no, over my dead body. I didn't say it that way, but, my mean, was exactly meaning that, if you get what I mean. And so all we did is we said, okay, we'll give her a place where she can, have her flock, and we'll start other Sabbath school classes that are more in keeping with some of the ways, that some of the new people want to see the Bible. And so that's basically, how it started. I didn't understand that God was growing a church in his own way. I tell this story to celebrate what God has wrought. I've already said it isn't the formula that can fit every situation. For the truth is that a journey toward inclusion doesn't happen by following a strategic plan. I take no credit. The only credit I take is that I decided that I wanted to be inclusive. I think that I owe some of this to my mother. My brother Charles is here. Charlie, do you remember we lived in Magdalena next to a lesbian couple? And one of the, one of the lesbians was tough. She went around with a 45 tucked here. And one day, I was being critical, and my mother said, no, she is God's child. So I became friends, and I'd go over there, and they'd give me cookies. There's an important lesson there. And so I owe a lot to my mother. I owe a lot to many members of the congregation who were the right kind of people in the right place. I owe a lot to the Southern California Conference of Seventh-day Adventists. What began to happen is that we brought Bobby Herr back as choir director. Now, I don't know if you've ever heard the name Bobby Herr, but he's one of the finest choir directors anywhere. And before long, we had one of the best choirs in the whole greater Los Angeles area. We gained a reputation of being the choir that people wanted to join. So when movie stars or, people who were playing, at the Pantages or somewhere else, when they were in town for a few months, they'd ask around and they wanted to keep their voices up. They said, is there a choir available anywhere, where Glendale City Church. We ended up with a choir that was 80% non-Adventist. As you know, this is against polity, and it certainly was at that time. Is it possible for us to have people in the choir who aren't Adventists, who are singing praises to God? Can the Lord use non-Adventists? I hate even to use the term because the term is pejorative, it's already exclusive, it's dividing. I don't like that term. I use it only to try to express to us what was happening. So we went to the conference, and we asked the conference to make the city church a pilot program where anybody who was attending the church would now be eligible to sing in the choir, to be in other positions in the church. And what happened is that this went to the conference committee, and it won by one vote. The Lord works in mysterious ways, his wonders to perform. So, what happened is that people would come, and some of them were agnostics and atheists. I ended up baptizing 6 agnostics and atheists out of the choir every year for about 7 or 8 years. They had never heard of a loving God. They had heard of the God that many, many Christians portray. These individuals, weren't closed. They were open to the Spirit. They would talk to me, and they basically would say, I can't believe in a God that does this and this and this and this. I said, you have just given me a wonderful Bible study in the true God. Because you see, their misunderstandings of God juxtapositioned against their understandings of God was already a way to bring them. I gave this talk at Glendale City Church about 3 weeks ago, and somebody said, tell them about Eduardo Villa. Eduardo Villa was one of the people that joined the choir. He was an opera singer. He had just won a top award in the nation for an amateur opera singer. He joined our choir. He is now one of the soloists at the New York Metropolitan Opera in New York City. He started bringing other opera singers. And let me tell you, we had a choir. It was better than the Mitzelfeld Chorale. It was better than the choir that sings at Disney Hall. It was good. What hath God wrought? It started bringing in people. Eduardo Villa was baptized. He became a faithful member of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and I think he still is. God was growing a church. The problem is that if we're really going to be an inclusive church, we need to listen to every voice in the congregation. And so what we started to do is this. We got to listen to senior citizens. We have to listen to young families. We have to listen to singles. We have to provide ministries for everybody across the board. Because to the degree that we exclude one segment of the congregation, to that degree, we are not an inclusive congregation. And these are usually the people that begin to complain when inclusion doesn't include them. I looked around and I realized that 70% of the members of the Glendale City Church were women. I looked at the church board, not one woman. I looked at committees, not one woman. It was a male. 30% of the people were making 100% of the decisions. And I said, this doesn't seem right to me. If we are the people who believe in the priesthood of all believers, then there is something wrong when 70% of the priests are excluded from serving the Lord in a public way. And so we started having women elders, women members of the board. We brought on a woman onto the staff, Linda Gage. The other thing that we did was there was a woman in the congregation, Marguerite Marsh. I don't know if any of you know her, a clinical psychologist, and she came in, she volunteered as a clinical psychologist, and she was on our staff. She told me the other day, she said, you have no idea how important it was for me to start coming to staff meeting and to understand the workings of the church from the perspective of pastors. From the perspective of pastors, the church looked very, very different than it does in the pew. Pastors are called upon to respond to the situation in a pastoral way. And quite often, we do things that are misunderstood, but I can tell you that if the pew were involved in that situation, the pew would go exactly the same way that pastors go. Because pastors have a pastor's heart, and the congregation does too, if it understands. So our vision as a church family at Glendale City Church became love and inclusion. We intentionally set about to love and welcome every person who attended our services. They became members of our church family. They became deacons. They became members of the board. I looked at the church roster, and we had 1,750 members, 250 attending, 50 of whom were not members, if you look at the church roster. Then I asked the question, who were the members? Were the members those people who are in the pew? Well, you know what happened. We started including them. By the way, one of those people who became a deacon, I baptized about 6 months ago. A Jewish man. He accepted Jesus as Messiah. I was asked to go to Kinship Camp Meeting. I don't know if you know what Kinship Camp Meeting is. Kinship is an organization of Seventh-day Adventist homosexuals. It's not officially a part of the church. It is separate. I was asked to go there. And You know, when I went there, I was full of trepidation. This was in Colorado in the mountains. It was absolutely beautiful, but I started to hear horror stories. At kinship camp meeting every year, and these are annual camp meetings that are held all over. You know, it's the gay men and gays and lesbians come together and they start telling their stories of how they were treated in the church. It's called the horror story session. It's awful. And you know, when I started to hear the way the churches had excluded, some had actually been given electric shock to change them. Some had been in the middle of Iowa, in the middle of winter. One father put his son out there in the cornfield without a stitch of clothing on, and said, that he wouldn't accept them back into the house until he agreed, to become a heterosexual. On and on and on. Terrible things. Alienation. And I thought to myself, I'm not going to be able to reach these individuals. I represent the very church that has rejected them. I couldn't have been further from the truth. I preach on the perils of a Jesus, on the inclusive Jesus. And then we had communion service. And there are 125 people, and I'm conducting the communion service. And when they started to participate in the elements, the bread and the grape juice, they started weeping. And everybody wept. And these great big men, 6'4", 6'5", 6'7", were weeping like a baby. And it turned into a weeping and for 45 minutes, maybe an hour, everybody wept and wept and wept. Somebody said, I thought I was lost. I haven't been able to take communion for 17 years, for 15 years, for 12 years. Do you mean to tell me that there is grace enough for me? And I thought to myself, wouldn't I love to pastor this congregation? It is the most poignant service that I have ever been a part of. And that did something profound to me. As it turned out, I started to receive calls from gay men and gay and lesbians all over the country. And I became known as a person who would minister. Then something happened. I think this is really a profound story. When I was pastor in the Tidewater area of Virginia, I was interning. I gave Bible studies to a woman who became an Adventist. Her husband absolutely rejected her. Her husband hated me. He ordered me out of the house. He was so angry at her for becoming an Adventist that he went and tried to murder her. He got a pistol, and it jammed. And so he pistol whipped her, and she ended up in the hospital. He ended up in prison for several years. One day I'm preaching, and I see her walk into Glendale City Church. And we become reacquainted. Do you remember? Of course I remember you. We hugged. How's it going? Wonderful. She's the one that told me, when she was recovering from, you couldn't recognize her. Her features, were so swollen. She said, I am happier now than I have ever been in my life. I have found Jesus. She comes in and she says, my son is dying of AIDS. Would you be willing to minister to him? What would you say? You're a pastor. What would you say? I said, absolutely. Turned out that he was in Hollywood. He was a writer. He wrote scripts in Hollywood. He was dying of AIDS. So I went and I visited him. And I visited him several times, and I read scripture to him, and he was open to the scripture. And one day I was leading him to the Lord. And I look over my right shoulder, and there at the entrance is his father. His father had rejected him 15 years before, didn't want anything to do with him. I reject you as a son. I never had you. And now he hears that his son is dying of AIDS, and he's there, and you can just see, the body language. He wants to be there, but he doesn't know if he should be there. And he sees me, and he recognizes me, and I'm this terrible person that has taken his lovely wife. They were divorced. But, I'm the person, that he blamed me for the divorce. I walked up to him, and I said, "I'm Rudy Torres." He said, "I know who you are." I said, "I know who you are too." I said, "Don't you think it's time for you to be reconciled to your son?" I took him by the arm, gently, and I led him. And it was reconciliation time. He said, my son, my son, my son, how will you ever forgive me for rejecting you, for cutting you out of my will, for not helping you when you were down and out, and so forth and so on." And they hugged. And, the son said, "Father, I forgive you. I'm now a Christian." Well, I became known as a person who would conduct AIDS funerals. And one day I get a call. Not loud enough? Okay, thank you. One day I get a call, and the call is from Berrien Springs, Michigan. And a parent, on the phone says, our son has AIDS. We are so embarrassed. We need to get him out of our church. We're going to be disfellowshipped if they know our son has AIDS. We'd like to take him to California if you'll minister to him there. And so they did, and I ministered to him, and I conducted his funeral. And of course, the only people that were there were mother, father, and his sister, and me. Totally, totally silent. But we became known as a place, that would do this sort of thing. So I conducted many AIDS funerals. What began to happen is that other, gays with an Adventist background began to come into the church. And we were baptizing, and we baptized one individual. His name is Carlos Martinez. Carlos Martinez became a Seventh-day Adventist, and as soon as he became a Seventh-day Adventist, he just started going to the gay bars, in Hollywood and West Hollywood and so forth, and conducting Bible studies. So he would bring these gay men to us and said, so-and-so wants to be baptized. Some of them became celibate. Some didn't. Do you baptize them or don't you? We baptized them. What we didn't know is that Carlos had AIDS. Now, what you need to know about Carlos is that he was wonderfully charismatic. He had a lovely personality. He knew everybody in the church. He would go up to you. If he didn't know you, he'd say, "Who are you? I'm so-and-so." Everybody loved Carlos. Nobody, except a couple of us on the pastoral staff, knew that he was dying of AIDS. He was coming to my Bible study class. I conducted a Bible study class on Wednesday morning, and there were 25 or 30 women, all my age or older. And these were the conservative members of the congregation. And we were studying the Gospel of John, and we were studying the Spirit. And there was a woman who was coming. I had just had his funeral about 3 weeks before. This was a brilliant young man with a PhD from Stanford who died of cirrhosis of the liver. And she said, I don't think God is ever going to forgive me. I beat him terribly as a child. I drove him to alcoholism. Now he's dead. Will God ever forgive me? And Carlos looked at me and said, Pastor, shall I? And I knew what he was going to do. And I said, we've been studying the Holy Spirit. You let the Spirit guide you. He says, all right. He says, none of you know that I am a homosexual. I'm dying of AIDS. You could just hear. And he says, I want you to know that I became infected with AIDS in the gay lifestyle of the gay bars. He says, I have been celibate now for 3 years. God has forgiven me. And if he has forgiven me, he can forgive you. And, it was one of the most poignant times in my ministry. I was looking down like this, just waiting, for the other boot to drop. I look up, and there's one of the saints in Israel, Trudy Farr. She is now 101 years of age, still a member of the church. And she stood up. She was a nurse. This is the mid-'80s. We didn't really understand AIDS. We didn't know how it was contracted outside of the, sex. I mean, she went and hugged him. Next thing I know, there were 25, 30 women waiting to hug him. That story went out throughout the congregation. I can tell you, it is the story that made the difference. Everybody said, did you know that Carlos is gay and is dying of AIDS? He ended up on the AIDS ward in one of the hospitals there in Los Angeles. And church members visited him around the clock. He had 75 people visiting him. And one day I went to visit him, and the head nurse called me over and said, who are you people anyway? And I said, we are members of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and he's ours. He said, follow me. She takes me, to a room. Said, see that young man there? He's been here for 2 months. Not one visitor. His parents have rejected him. His family has rejected him. Not one visitor. She took me to another room. You see that man? 3 months. Not one visitor. She says, he's the only one who's getting visitors. Who are you anyway? What's your address? She started attending Glendale City Church. Now, Carlos is close to death, and he calls me, and he says, Rudy, he says, I'm going to die. He said, you know what my biggest regret is? I said, no. What is it, Carlos? He said that I'm not going to be able to give a combined budget to Glendale City Church. This church has saved my life, and it has saved the life of my friends. He said, I have a $25,000 life insurance policy. I'm leaving $7,000 for my mother, $7,000 for my brother, and $7,000 to the church. $4,000 will pay my bills and bury me. He says, I want you to take that $7,000 and I want you to invest it wisely so that it continues to give money to combined budget. I said, my brother, I'll do that. We had a funeral the likes of which that church has never seen. I've done AIDS funerals, 3 and 4, 8 people. 600 of our church members showed up. It totally changed the complexion and the attitude of the entire congregation. Uh, it changed their attitude toward me. Now, when some of these elite people were on their deathbeds, I can remember one in particular who just didn't want me there. And he said, he said, call Rudy. I want him to be at my bedside when I die. He has a heart. After Carlos died, I went to the church board and I said, we got to do something with these $7,000. And I said, I have an idea. Let's start an endowment. And that's how the endowment started. It is now $2.25 million. And it gives the church anywhere from $90,000 to $140,000 a year. Carlos, who keeps on giving. Now, you understand that inclusion has to be an ongoing task. New people come in, the old people die, they leave, and so forth and so on. So let me tell you what happened, when things were really, really getting a little bit intolerant for some gays. There was a woman by the name of Gladys Golay, and she's given me permission to tell her story. I have permission to tell all these stories. Gladys Golay was very, very ill one day, and she called the church pastor at that time, Mitch Henson. And she said, Mitch, I've just had surgery, and I don't understand what I'm doing alive. I'm already 85 years of age. She had been the wife of a Methodist minister. She had been reared an Adventist, had fallen in love with him, had become a Methodist, and then when he retired, she went to him and she said, Gene, have I been a good wife? Yes, you have. I now want to go back to my church. And so he said, and he told me this himself, he said, I realized how much she loved me. She was willing to go to my church, for my 45 years of ministry, and now it was my turn to go to her church. So Jean and Gladys Golay were in the congregation every week. Now Gladys is sick. She's asking, does God have a purpose for me? And, Mitch Henson said, if you're still alive, God has a purpose for you. Well, I wish he'd tell me because nothing's coming through to me. And she was just very discouraged. When she recovers, she goes back to the congregation, and she said, she says, this church needs to be a more friendly church. So she started moving around the congregation rather than staying in the same place. And she ended up in what are known as the pink pews. That's where the gays and the lesbians congregate on Sabbath morning. And she started, this was her family. What I ought to do is I ought to read what Mitch wrote. Mitch Henson died a few years ago. And now I'm going to have Gladys's funeral if I outlive her. She's already 103. Here's what happened. Gladys calls Mitch and says, come immediately. And now Gladys is probably about 88 years of age now. You must come right over, she says. You must come right over. Mitch thought that Gladys had a recurrence of cancer, and he went right over and found her in distress. Now Mitch is sitting with Gladys in her living room, and she is saying, "Pastor, you got to help me. I'm in serious trouble. I just discovered that some people believe the young men I sit with in the back of the pew are gay." And I said to them, "It's a lie. It's a damnable lie." And I corrected their judgment. She said, "I told one of the boys that some people were saying that they were gay, and he looked at me and he said, 'What they say is true.'" And she said, "Pastor, I have not been able to sleep for 2 days and 2 nights. I am totally devastated." 88 years of age, remember. You see, for years as a Methodist, I have believed that the Bible is true when it says that homosexuality is an abomination to God, and I have taught many people, and I have agreed with many people who say that it is a sin, and this is an active lifestyle. And that there is no salvation for anyone who is homosexual. "But Pastor," she said, "I have come to love these boys. I have brought them to my home. They have hugged and kissed me and shown me the love and affection that I have always wanted and that I've looked for. And I've given it to them. And we have a great friendship. And we have more than that. We have great love for each other. How," she said, "how, Pastor, can I turn my back on these boys now? I cannot possibly do this. I am in a quandary. What do you say?" I quote from Mitch. He says, "Well, I don't know how you would answer a question like that. It was certainly a wonderful yet difficult question. I said to Gladys that I had known that she had been showing these young men attention for several years. I told her that it had meant a lot to me, and I told her that I deeply appreciated the fact that in her 80s she was wrestling with an issue that most people had decided not to wrestle with in their teens or 20s or 30s. I told her that most people in their 70s and 80s hang on to the truths that they know from childhood or from the active portions of their life and never even consider changing their religious perspective. And I said to her, therefore I must tell you, Gladys, that I have the deepest admiration for the pain and the suffering you are going through. I am not glad you're suffering it in one way, but in another way, it is nothing more than an indication of what a deeply spiritual person you really are. That you would find yourself questioning yourself as you're facing the issues of your friends and what to do with them. She said, I can't reject them. I just can't do it. I love them too much, but I don't know what to do. And I said, that's Mitch. And I said, Gladys, I think we ought to pray about this. And I think I agree with you that you cannot reject them. God has called you somehow to do this ministry, and you have done it well. I said, Gladys, I must tell you, based on the authority of God's word and based on what I know church life to be, that this is part of what God has called you to do. And I would encourage you to continue to pray, continue to think, and continue to observe, and by all means continue to do your ministry. These young men have not asked you to endorse their lifestyle. Neither have they asked you to be their judge. And so she accepted them. Didn't judge them. I always say that the church has been called to love, not to judge, because judgment belongs to God. And those of you, who know the intricacies of church congregations, you know the stuff that goes on in church congregations, don't you? If I went right by the rules, some years I could disfellowship half the congregation. We have not been called upon to judge. You notice that this has not been an endorsement of the gay lifestyle. We're not talking theology. We're not talking its morality. We're not talking its ethic. As soon as you do that, you're going to split a church. That is left brain, and it's in the left brain where all the civil wars take place. What changes us is stories. So I tell stories. And stories have the power to go right into our right brains, into our hearts. That's where love takes place. That's where fellowship takes place. Judgment belongs to God, not to Rudy Torres. One of these days, if I outlive her, I will have Gladys Golay's funeral. I'm in her will. And I'm going to tell this story. And she's given me permission to do it. Now she's going to be I don't know how, she's still healthy. She came to church 3 weeks. She lives in the Inland Empire now, which is over there near Loma Linda. And, we're in Glendale. But she comes, about once a month, and guess who brings her? Her gay friends. One of them, they have taken her into their home, and they're taking care of her. It is absolutely phenomenal. Don't say anything against her boys. But I know who's going to be there because I had the funeral for her husband, Gene. And when I was there, all of her gay friends were there supporting her. He drew a circle that shut me out. Heretic, rebel, a thing to flout. But love and I had the will to win. We drew a circle that took him in. Thank you. Thank you.
What a beautiful story, Rudy. Thank you. It started out early in my life, becoming acquainted with the topic of homosexuality. My cousin, and of course I didn't understand what was going on. I remember all of the coercive things that were applied to him to try to keep him from being a sissy and to grow up to be a man. But it has slowly clarified as time has gone on. And this morning, your story, Rudy, has really illustrates what has to happen in the minds of people who are under the curve of normalcy and how we relate to those who are down on the skirts. There are lots of questions, I'm sure. Well, some of the questions, and I'm a left-brained person, but there are some left-brained questions that may want to be asked, but the right-brain questions are certainly stimulated this morning, and we thank you for that stimulation. Please raise your hand, indicate what you'd like to ask or comment on.
Now with every head bowed and every eye closed.
Mr. Torres, I think you are wonderful. I don't know, are you a pastor too? You're a pastor.
I was a pastor. I've been retired for a few years.
I thank you for the wonderful job that you're doing, and you have a beautiful heart. and God knows it. Keep up the good work.
Thank you.
I know you're a pastor. My name is Sani Inyewero. My question is, as a pastor, I think anything you do should have a biblical frame of reference. From what you are doing in your church, does it reflect any reference in the Bible?
Basically, I would say yes. Let the wheat and the tares grow together until the time of the harvest. We are called to love, not to judge. Those are the compelling values that we have attached ourselves to. And I can tell you that when people get in trouble, when they have ethical issues to face, I have been there for them. But I think you see that these ethical issues need to take place in the individual, not in the congregation. There is such a thing as privacy. As you know, we live in a litigious society, and if some things you see were to be divulged openly, I'm not using this as an excuse. I am basically saying that even our litigious society is channeling us as a church to be very, very careful with the sanctity of people's lives. And so that's what we hold very, very highly. And, in the process, lives are changed. It's just an amazing thing what happens. I guess I've said enough.
Rudy, one thing that pops into my mind is the statement by Jesus, inasmuch as you've done it unto one of the least of these, and I've often thought, I wonder just what is the least of these in the Seventh-day Adventist community, and I think that probably the LGBT topic is getting down there pretty close to the bottom of the least.
Yes, no, I say that. And even the text that says, when Jesus says, the woman caught in adultery, go and sin no more. That was Jesus. That wasn't Rudy Torres. That was Jesus. And I think, that Jesus tells us, go and sin no more. And he didn't, he tells us this in the sanctity of our own lives, in the privacy of our own homes. I could tell you miracles, but I don't want to justify what we did by the results. But I could tell you as many stories of just wonderful, wonderful victories.
We have a question here.
Yeah, thank you. I sort of got the idea that your philosophy is to take the exclusive doctrines and simplify them to the religion of Jesus, not about Jesus. Love God and love your fellow man.
Yes, I would say that's true. I believe that every doctrine teaches a new facet of who Jesus, God, the Holy Spirit is. And so I think doctrine are very important. But I agree with your statement.
I'm just curious, what do you do, what approach do you use for those that are, say, on the far right or whatever, that just really think that it's just wrong, it's just terrible? How do you get them to accept them, stay in the church, and not just all of a sudden become thorns in the church's side as well and splitting the church. How do you keep that from happening?
You don't do it all the time. There was a section there that I overlooked for lack of time, but this is the story of the ecstasy of the agony. And sometimes you do lose members, and sometimes you gain members. My approach is that I go and I talk to them. And, when I was a pastor, I would say, you know that I love you. They said, yeah, we know that. I said, if somebody were after you for thinking, that homosexuality is wrong, I would defend you to my dying day. And not if they said you would. I said, absolutely. I said, we're a family. As you know, the Seventh-day Adventist Church is the most heterogeneous of all churches with the exception of the Roman Catholic. And you know why? The Sabbath funnels us all into the same bottle. If I weren't an Adventist, I'd probably be an Episcopalian. Somebody else, would be a Pentecostal. We're all there together. And so, and basically, what I say unless we learn how to live with our differences, we're not going to become the people of God that He has called us to become. He has not called us, to become, conformist. He has not called us, He has called us to unity, but unity and diversity, not unity and uniformity. And so, and that works most of the time. Sometimes it's a real battle. If she were here, she'd tell you the story. But, this is years ago, and she was just really struggling with this issue. And, she was confronting, one of the gays, in the congregation, and she would just berating him with texts and hammers and everything else. And and so she came and she talked to me. And so I knew her really well. And I said, you know I love you, don't you? She said, yes. I said, well, I'm going to wrestle you. I said, we're not going to discuss the rightness or wrongness, of homosexuality. We're going to discuss how you are relating to it. And we started out probably around 9 o'clock. It was after a Bible study meeting. And we were still going at 1 o'clock in the morning. She will still tell you that is the most profound 3 or 4 hours she has ever experienced in her life. And she says, thank you, Rudy. So, it takes that sort of thing. But, you just can't do it in a vacuum. I had visited her in her home. I had gone to visit her son, who was very ill. I had worked with her husband, who was Jewish, and so forth. So you have to have money in the bank with people.
Mark?
God is using you in a mighty way, brother. I see God's love shining through you, and I see your loving heart, and it touches me to the core. And I just want to, God loves everybody. He died for every single person, and we're not to judge, and we're not to hold our love and abandon, and even these people are abandoned and shunned and even hated, and even by Christians. How can we call ourselves Christians and do something like that? And we're not to judge them. I have a very short little poem I wrote about God's love, because that's the most important thing in the whole world. To be a Christian, you must have His love. The love in your heart wasn't put there to stay. Love isn't love until you give it away. The kind word, the soft touch, the smile you display will lift in the spirit and brighten the day. But sorrow will come and gloom too, you say. It will come, my friend, but don't let it stay. Let the warmth of God's love chase your troubles away. and make tomorrow a new and much better day.
Beautiful.
Thank you, Mary.
I have a question. Richard mentioned the Matthew 25, least of these sort of understanding. And I personally can see I resonate with that. But I wonder if you're talking to someone in the LGBT community and they are of a persuasion that God made them that way, it almost seems like it would be off-putting to put them in a category as the least of these.
I totally agree. I agree. In fact, I'll just tell you something that happened to me, that kind of illustrates that. I was going to kinship, every year for 3 or 4 years, and there were people in the congregation who basically, I was single at the time, so they assumed, that I was gay. And so the rumor started going out of the congregation. Did you know that Rudy's gay? Did you know that Rudy's gay? And so some of them came to me and they said, "We hear you're gay." Now, let me tell you, that is, how one responds really says whether one is sensitive over the very issue that you raised. And I just said so what if I am? And I walked away.
I want to insert something here, and you don't have to respond to this, but the big word in the community, in the Christian community, as to homosexuality is choice. Maybe you could comment for a moment on it, but Ron, go ahead and.
What do you mean, choice? Where people have a choice?
Oh, yes. In Christianity, and
yes.
The key is whether it's a choice or whether it is your DNA.
How much time do I have?
Well, you have about 6 minutes, five and a half minutes, and I want Ron to get his question in.
Well, I'll be very, oh my, I can't remember the person's name. But, first of all, I already had experience, with gays when I came to Glendale, because at Green Lake Church there were some gays in the community. There was one young man who, just a wonderful man. I mean, just a powerful preacher. He was a lay preacher. He just powerful, and he decided, that he wanted God to change him. So he went on a fast. He didn't eat anything for 2 weeks, and of course one day he just passed out and they had to rush him to the hospital. And he came to me and he said, I've asked the Lord, to change me, and I want to be changed. He wanted to be changed because it's difficult to be, especially, in the late 70s. It was very, very difficult, to be a gay person in a community. He had been beat up many times, on and on. He says, God doesn't change me. He says, so I'm just going to accept the fact that maybe, I am who I am, and that's it. But I'm always open to change. So change ministry. Then, there was an Adventist who decided to do change ministry. And Colin Cook. The Adventist church held him as a wonderful example. I can't tell you how many gay men who went there I have counseled, who went there and who were exploited sexually in the process. I don't know that we understand, but I can tell you that I have seen. I don't think it's a choice.
Well, I've known those who tried to choose otherwise. Put myself in their place. What if someone told me I was to have the other response? I don't know what I would do about that. Ron?
Okay, I just wanted to thank you, your approach of stories. Because I think what happens too often is we like to look at things as them, and that puts it out there. When you deal in your stories, it's him and her, one-on-one. And I think that makes a big difference.
If we have another question, we have a couple of minutes. Who has, did I see a hand over here? Over here then, your hand.
First I want to thank you for coming and sharing these stories. I recently read something, I don't know if it was on the Kinship website or if it was Deneen and Stephen Akers, and it was something that really stuck to me. It said, what if gays are God's way of seeing if we really do love each other? And I think about that daily because I grew up a Methodist. My father's family was very conservative Adventist and really did never include us because we were of the world. And so I thought about that and making comment now about what's going on in our country, in our churches, aren't we called just to do three things? Love, grace, kindness? It doesn't really go any further. And forgiveness.
Well, I think we are called to love. And it is our love, it is God's love through us that changes people. This doesn't change anybody.
No.
I'll just have one other little story, just 1 minute. I gave this talk at Glendale City Church, 3 or 4 weeks ago, I forget when. And there was a woman, it's on tape, and it was videotaped and all, and so it's public knowledge. But during the question and answer period, she said, I thank God for this congregation. If it weren't for this congregation, I wouldn't have any place to go. She said, my father was gay and he died of AIDS. And she just broke down and just wept, and many of us wept with her. And I thought to myself, when I went to Glendale City Church, she was a little girl, and now she's a grown woman. And I said, I guess I did that for my kid. It was pretty touching.
I am glad I was here this morning. And I feel the same sort of experience on your part. We thank you for your attendance. And Rudy, I love your story. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for being here, and we will adjourn now till the following the service. And again, you're all welcome at the Meet the Speaker session following or during the potluck lunch. Thank you.